This week on Q&A, NASA Administrator Charles Bolden discusses his career at the agency, his life in the military, and his decision to attend the United States Naval Academy.
Charles Bolden, NASA Administrator, if you had your choice, would you rather be an astronaut in the shuttle or run the NASA administration?
Ooh, since I'm running the NASA right now, I'd rather be doing what I'm doing.
Why?
I am a person who, I live in the moment, and people who know me know that I tell them I don't regret anything, no matter how bad. What's done is done, and I would not change anything because I have three beautiful granddaughters who are 6, 10, and 13, and I'm fearful that if I went back and changed any minor thing, I might not have them.
135 missions of the space shuttle.
Yes, sir.
$200 billion. 30 years. Was it worth it?
It was worth every dime. As a matter of fact, let me start with what I think Shuttle did for the nation over its incredible 30 years that most people will never think about unless somebody tells them. The technical world in which I live is very non-diverse. There are not a lot of people who look like me. In fact, in the history of the Space Shuttle program, there were only 2 pilots of African American descent in 30 years. And there are a lot of different reasons for it, some of which we are not proud of because I think we didn't work hard enough. But Shuttle brought diversity to an incredibly technical program. It allowed people of all walks. We have had a farm worker. We have had school teachers. We've had people like me go to space who never would have done that had it not been for the Space Shuttle era. That's a human interest side of what the shuttle did. And for this nation that professes to be the shining city on the hill, I think that's important. There are 2 other nations that can send humans to space right now, China and Russia. And other than the fact that Russia helps us get people to space, there would be very little diversity in who goes to space with the Russian program, and there is no diversity in who goes to space with the Chinese program to date. It's a program in its infancy, but so far it's been only Chinese with the Chinese program.
What is your guess that the space travel will be like 10 years from now? And how many countries will be involved in it? And will there be people landing somewhere out there in space?
10 years from now, we will still be operating, I hope, on the International Space Station as our toehold to the universe. I would love to say that 10 years from now, humans will have landed on Mars, but that's not the course on which we're embarked. The President challenged us to put humans on Mars, or at least in the Martian environment, in the 2030s. So that's a little far outside the 10-year window. We should be there. We should have been there now. But there may be humans on the moon inside that 10-year window if NASA is successful in fostering the development of commercial space and entrepreneurial space to the extent that we're trying to do right now. There are some private enterprises who really believe that they can put humans on the moon, and so we have formal agreements with some of them to provide engineering expertise and other assistance, in a non-reimbursable basis. So it is conceivable. My belief is, my personal belief is that it probably is a little bit outside the 10-year time frame.
What about either Russia or China?
No, not in 10 years. Technologically, we have the capability of doing it. We're about leading the world in exploring deeper into space than we've ever done before. And so that's why we're embarked on 2 big human enterprises over and above the International Space Station right now. By 2025, humans should have come in contact with an asteroid. They'll be in some people call it cislunar, some people call it translunar, but they'll be in an orbit around the moon, around our moon, but interacting with an asteroid if we're successful in a new asteroid strategy that we've been working on for several decades now, but we formally introduced as a part of the President's 2014 budget. And then after that, as a follow-on, if we are able to develop the technologies from that mission, solar electric propulsion, increased efficiency in our life support, in our environmental control and life support system, such that the cabin in which the humans live can stand an 8-month trip to Mars, and then, living perhaps in something like that for prolonged periods of time. And then just new spacesuits, new spacewalk suits, all kinds of things. There's radiation protection is probably the biggest challenge right now for an extensive trip all the way out to Mars. But that's where we're going.
Where'd you grow up?
Grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. My wife and I are proudly from Columbia, South Carolina. Jackie Bolden, as everybody knows her. We are both the products of teachers. My mom and dad were lifelong teachers until they died. Jackie's mom and dad both died as teachers, and they dedicated themselves to education. We both grew up in the segregated South, so my being here is very improbable. If anybody had asked if I would be here when I was growing up in South Carolina, I think the answer would have been a resounding no way. It was hard enough just to get to the Naval Academy, but I grew up in Columbia.
How did you get into the Naval Academy?
Long story, but I will make it very short. I fell in love with the Naval Academy over television. I saw a program on television when I was in 7th grade called Men of Annapolis that talked about life at the Naval Academy. There was West Point story. There were a lot of military stories when I was growing up. And I saw the uniform. That's probably the biggest thing. And the fact that lots of women, lots of girls came to the Naval Academy on the weekends. And with no knowledge of the Navy or the Naval Academy, I said, that's where I want to go. And so I decided in 7th grade I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. In 9th grade, I started writing my congressman, my 2 state senators, and the President of the United States saying, the Vice President saying, I really want to go to the Naval Academy. And each year I would get a letter back that said, hey, a little too early, write us when you're a senior. And I became a senior in 1960, graduated in 1964, and most people who are my age or maybe close will remember that in November of 1963 we lost President Kennedy. I had been writing ever since he became Vice President to Lyndon Johnson. He became President and I was no longer eligible for an appointment from him, so I wrote one more letter to the President and said, I know you can't help, or I'm not eligible, but I need help. I can't get an appointment out of South Carolina. Can you do something? Never heard from him. But about a week later, a Navy recruiter showed up at my front door and said, hey, I understand you're interested in going to the Naval Academy. A couple of months after that, a retired federal judge by the name of Judge Bennett came around, traveled around the country at the behest of President Johnson, looking for young men of color who were interested in going to the service academies. And so between Judge Bennett and the Navy recruiters, I got an appointment through Congressman William Dawson from Chicago, Illinois, to the Naval Academy. So I became a member.
Who was an African American?
He was African American. He was an Army veteran, and never met him. He's long gone now, but I never had an opportunity to meet the person
who was the congressman in South Carolina?
South Carolina? Well, Olin D. Johnston and Strom Thurmond were my 2 state senators. Well, two U.S. senators. And Albert Watson was the congressman. And in each case, they all responded. Strom Thurmond said, I can't. He was the most honest. He said, politically infeasible to do this. And
because of color?
Because of color at that time. Olin Johnston offered to consider me for an appointment to the Merchant Marine Academy, and I wasn't interested in that. And I'd just never heard anything from Congressman Albert Watson. My mother, to her dying day, believes that Strom Thurmond played a role in getting me into the Naval Academy, because every single milestone in my life until he died, I would get a note from Strom Thurmond.
Go back to, you said the uniform attracted you, but...
Oh, yeah.
But... You know what I'm going to say. You go to the academy and you switch your uniform.
I sure did.
To United States Marine.
I knew 2 things when I graduated from high school. 2. That's all I knew. And they were both negative. Under no circumstances was I going to go into the Marine Corps. I lived in Columbia, South Carolina, an hour and a half drive from Parris Island. On the weekends, Marines came into town because back then, where else were the black Marines going to go but they'd come to Columbia, and they'd go to Drew Park swimming pool where I worked, and I got to see Marines up close and personal. They were crazy. And then I did not want to fly airplanes. I thought that was inherently dangerous. So the two things I knew was I would not fly and I would not be a Marine. My very first year at the at the Naval Academy, my first company officer was a gentleman by the name of Major John Riley Love, who was an infantry officer. So much like my dad, he was tough, but incredibly fair. And although we were together for just 1 year, for my freshman year at the Naval Academy, he so impressed me that my senior year I said, I want to be like him. So that's how I did it.
Marine flyer. How many sorties over Vietnam?
I flew 100 missions into North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So during the campaign, I flew 100 combat missions.
What kind of a plane?
I was an A6 Intruder pilot, the best airplane that God ever allowed man to make. It was awesome. We sat side by side, tandem seating. It was an attack aircraft, so no supersonic flying, no fighter flying. All we did was deliver weapons to a target on the ground. And most of my flying was done over North Vietnam, and they were generally night, low-level interdiction missions, single plane. You very seldom went out at night with more than one airplane in the A6.
How old were you?
Oh, I was young and foolish. I was a first lieutenant, so I was probably 24, 25.
So as you think back to those missions over North Vietnam, what's a moment that you remember?
Oh, the one moment I remember is the time I didn't think I was coming home. I didn't think I was going to get back. It was just a mission we went in. We had a particular, back then we were kind of stupid about how we did things. Our ingress routes were almost always the same. The target times were almost always the same. Everything was repeatable back then. And so my bombardier nav, we were at liberty to arrange our ingress any way we wanted to do it, but the targets were going to be the same no matter what. And there was one area, an area called Quang Qui Bridge, that was in the southern portion of North Vietnam. And every time you went in there, they knew you were coming, they knew what time you were coming, and they started shooting even before you got there. And this particular night, the fire was incredibly intense, and we were inbound to the target, and there's stuff all around, and you knew that the worst thing to do would be to try to turn around and go out because you're going to spend that much more time in it. So we just pressed on to the target. We were about 500 feet above the ground, so you knew that they couldn't see you, that they were depending on sound, and probably not picked up on radar. But we just didn't think we were going to make it that night, and I distinctly remember that. Came back. Not a scratch on the airplane. Our trousers may have been damaged, but other than that, everything was okay.
Where were you flying out of?
Flying out of a place called Nampong, Thailand. We affectionately called it the Rose Garden. And I remember leaving. I had taken my wife from Cherry Point, North Carolina, where my son was born. So he was had just turned 1 year old.
And he's a lieutenant colonel.
He's a lieutenant colonel now, a commander of a VMU-2, which is an unmanned aerial vehicle squadron, a drone squadron in Cherry Point, North Carolina. So he's been in Cherry Point twice. He was born there, and he went back there to take his command. So it's interesting, and he went over 20 years in the Marine Corps last week. So it could be, his first time being stationed there and last time. But I took my wife and son back to Columbia, where my mom and dad and Jackie's mom were, and put them in an apartment. And I flew out to Travis Air Force Base for my transportation over to what I thought was going to be Iwakuni, Japan. They had my sword, my dress blues, a trunk. And I landed, and they said, squadron left yesterday. Go to take your trunk over to the hangar and get out enough underwear and flight suits for a month because you're going south. And I went, going south where? I said, can't tell you. And ironically, when I called my wife, she said, what is the secret air base that the Marine Corps has? I said, what are you talking about? She said, it was on the cover of Time magazine. So I ended up in this place called the Rose Garden, Nampong, Thailand, middle of the Thai jungle, in the middle of a Royal Thai training base. The Seabees had gone in and cleared all the Cobras and the jungle out. The Air Force had started putting a runway in for the F-111, but could never get the airplane to perform the way they wanted, and so they abandoned it. And the Seabees put an extra 1,000 feet of runway on either end to give us a 10,000-foot strip, and we moved into our tents and lived there for a year.
I'll come back to some of the personal stuff in a minute, but How big is NASA?
NASA's about roughly 18,000 people, so about the same size as the 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing that I commanded before I retired from the Marine Corps.
How much money will you spend in 2014?
In 2013, well, this fiscal year in which we're presently embarked, we'll spend about $16.8 billion. The budget was $17.7 and that's what the President has requested for 2014. But under sequester, we took a 5% across-the-board budget cut. So instead of spending at 17.7, we're spending at 16.8.
I'm going to put on the screen a historical NASA budget. And one of the things to look at is the percent of the budget. If you go back to 1966, which was the highest, it was 4.4. And if you come up to 2012, it was 0.48% of the budget. What's the difference?
Why that difference? A number of things. Primarily, Apollo is the time when it was 4.4%. We had an enemy. You know, there was the Soviet Union, the evil empire, and President Kennedy became determined that we were not going to be second to the Soviets when it came to space and exploration. And it's historic now. He uttered the challenge to NASA to put man on the moon before the end of the decade and bring him safely home. And so that's where that $4.4 billion came. And then it's a gradual ramp down from the Apollo era to where we are today. Our enemy today is us. We do still have an enemy, and the enemy is whether or not the fight is whether we will maintain our position as the dominant nation in the world technologically. The President talks about it all the time. You know, the nation that out-innovates, out-educates, and out-builds will be the leader in the world. And we're still out-innovating. We're not out-building anybody right now. There is no infrastructure development for the nation the way it has been at critical times throughout our history. Education is really under a lot of strain. You know, the President has really tasked all of us and challenged all of the federal agencies to come up with a viable STEM education program that's going to be effective and get our kids interested in science and math, so that when you and I go to deliver a commencement address, we're not going to see all the kids going through the School of Engineering be from some other country. The way it is today. We've got a big challenge here.
You were an electrical?
I was supposed to be an electrical engineer, but I flunked electromagnetic waves theory 2 at the Naval Academy, so I'm an electrical scientist.
And you got a master's degree where?
Master's from the University of Southern California in systems management, and it's sort of a hybrid of an engineering degree and an MBA that USC put together primarily for the Air Force as they entered an era where we were going to be doing much more acquisition.
When you left the Marine Corps, your rank was?
A Major General, 2-star General.
Here's some video. It's politics. It's back in the 2012 campaign. It's Newt Gingrich, and I'll show you what he has to say and then tell you to reflect on this.
Okay. We will have the first permanent base on the moon, and it will be American. We will have commercial, near-Earth activities that include science, tourism, and manufacturing, and are designed to create a robust industry precisely on the model of the development of the airlines in the 1930s, because it is in our interest to acquire so much experience in space that we clearly have a capacity that the Chinese and the Russians will never come anywhere close to matching. And by the end of 2020, we will have the first continuous propulsion system in space capable of getting to Mars in a remarkably short time, because I am sick of being told we have to be timid, and I'm sick of being told we have to be limited to technologies that are 50 years old.
How much of what he said do you believe?
He had read the President's, I am serious, I am certain he had read the President's national space policy, and he had read the President's presidential campaign space platform. And so much of what he says is already true, as a matter of fact. We have been living and working in space on the International Space Station now for almost 13 years. Science and engineering investigations, technology development goes on there every single day. We just launched our latest crew last week. Karen Nyberg is the American astronaut. She is one of 2 American astronauts there. The other one is a guy named Chris Cassidy, who is a Navy SEAL who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and is now an astronaut. There's an Italian who's there along with Russians. So we are doing that part already. We provide commercial transportation for cargo through SpaceX, which is an entrepreneurial company. It's not private company, not a big business, not a large industry provider, traditional provider. We have a second company called Orbital Sciences from right here in Dulles, Virginia, that launched their Antares rocket a little bit more than a month ago out of Wallops Island. That's a 2.5 hour drive from here, and they will fly their certification flight for us. So we'll have 2 American providers carrying cargo to the International Space Station. If we can get the Congress on board with the President's plan, we will select probably 1, maybe 1.5 from 3 American competitors to carry our crews to space. It is criminal to me that I had to authorize my budget people, my financial people, to write a check for $454 million a little bit more than a month ago to extend our contract with the Russians to continue to carry our crews to the International Space Station on Soyuz for 2016 and 2017, because we have not yet brought about the American capability that's coming with our commercial crew program. The President's budget called for $821 million for commercial crew. We are not halfway there. The Congress has my job is to try to persuade the Congress that the plan is good and that we're going to be efficient users of the taxpayers' money, and I've not been successful in that yet, but I'm working on it. We're up to 525, but as I have told every member of Congress with whom I've talked, $821 million in the 2014 budget is vital if we're to make the 2017 date, so that what Newt Gingrich said is true, that Americans are transported to space again on American spacecraft. Hall thrusters, solar electric propulsion is exactly what we're talking about. When he talks about faster propulsion, that's what we're doing with the asteroid mission that we've proposed. Among its technological leaps are larger solar electric propulsion engines that are made available through much larger solar cells. The engine is sized by the power that drives it. And technologically, we just don't have giant solar cells yet, but we're getting there.
When did you command the shuttle with joint with the Russians?
1994 was my last flight shuttle, my last space shuttle mission. People always ask, what's your fondest memory from your time in the space program? Meaning, what was the greatest thing that happened to you in orbit? And it wasn't on orbit. My fondest memory of my 14 years in the space program prior to now is the 2+ years that I spent training with Sergei Krikalev and Vladimir Titov, and having their family live alongside us in Houston, Texas. My family getting to know theirs, all the families working together. For me, that was priceless, and we remain the best of friends to this day. But that was 1994.
Why, when you read the daily reports coming out of Russia, it doesn't look like we have much of a relationship compared to what we expected to by now. Why do we get along in space but do not get along in politics?
Because we have a mission. And we are doing something that both nations recognize has a tremendous impact on humanity and the world. We are both dedicated when it comes to technological advancement of humanity. They want to do deep space exploration with us. They would like to do some robotic missions to the moon. They teamed with us to get to Mars. Russia has been trying since they were the Soviet Union to put something on the surface of Mars and have it work. And the first time that happened was when they flew a radiation instrument as a part of the scientific package on Curiosity. And it is today the source of much of the radiation data that we talked about last week in a press conference that tells us about the radiation environment between Earth and Mars, and now the radiation environment on the surface of Mars. And it's going to be critical for us because it's going to help us as we further the design of the crew, of the vehicles to carry crews, and of the places in which we live when we get to the Martian surface. We have a mission, and we have a common goal and a common understanding. I did not want to fly with the Russians, by the way. I was at NASA headquarters when I was the assistant deputy administrator. So I was working for Dan Golden, the NASA administrator at the time, the #3 guy in the agency, thinking I would never fly in space again. One of my mentors came in and said, "Hey, we want you to go back to Houston." I said, "That's great, because I hate DC." And he said, "We want you to fly and want you to command a mission." At the time, one of my hidden desires was to go back and fly as a commander for the first Hubble servicing mission, because I had flown on the mission that deployed it, and it wasn't it was great, but not in the best shape when we left it. And so to complete the circle, I really wanted to command the first station HST servicing mission. Dick Covey got an opportunity to do that, but the flight next after that was the first joint Russian-American shuttle mission, and I got named to command that. And I told them initially, "You got the wrong guy. I'm a Marine. I trained all my life to hate them and kill them," and they did the same thing for me. And they said, "How about calming down for a minute? 2 guys are going to be in town tonight. Would you go have dinner with them and talk?" And we did, got together with Sergei and Vladimir. Sergei was a fluent English speaker, young engineer, aerobatics champion from Moscow. Vladimir was a colonel in the Russian Air Force, MiG-21 pilot, spoke not a word of English. But the 3 of us sat and had dinner that night, and all we talked about was our families and our kids and, what we wanted to do. And I said, "I can do this."
So why wouldn't we just think that the Russians were going to get involved and look at our secrets and take them back to Russia?
We worried. We did worry, but we had practices and policies in place that allowed us to limit their access to certain things. There were places they couldn't go at KSC or JSC.
What's KSC?
I'm sorry, the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. And they did not have an opportunity to sit in on any briefs of classified missions or anything. So we jealously guarded what it was that we felt they did not need to know. But over time, the trust grew between us and among our training teams and everything. And by the time we flew, real small things. Drawing blood for experiments. In America, we do human research all the time. Astronauts are the primary guinea pigs, because that's all you have. At the time that we flew, Russian cosmonauts were not very well paid, and so they sold blood. If you wanted to do an experiment, and it was interesting because one of the major experiments that I worked on was a blood experiment, and it called for Franklin Chang Diaz, who was my twin on my crew. But Franklin and I were the 2 principal investigators on board for Dr. Peggy Whitson, who is now a former chief of the astronaut office, the first woman to command the International Space Station after she became an astronaut. But in order to get the Russians to participate, we would have had to go through a great long process to make arrangements to pay them, and we just weren't going to do that. Today, when I go to conferences with the Russians, like something called the International Space Medicine Summit that was held in Houston a couple of weeks back, they talk about the importance of exchange of data. We want to bring Russians out of the Russian segment of the International Space Station into the U.S. segment. We want to make it truly one space station the way it should be. And we're really working hard to do that.
What about the Chinese?
I am prohibited by law from working on a bilateral respect with the Chinese, and that's...
why is that?
Well, because the Congress, the President and President Hu, when he made an agreement between the U.S. and China to do what's called a joint committee in many areas. And I went to China as a part of that agreement to see their human spaceflight program, but some members of Congress did not appreciate that, so they put it into the law. They wrote it into the Appropriations Act that forbade NASA from doing bilateral relations with China, which is okay for right now. We are busy, and we are embarked on working with all of our other international partners on a future, which is exploration, which is going to Mars, going to an asteroid, doing those kinds of things.
Explain this, though. We let the Chinese buy $1 trillion of our debt, but we can't work with them in space?
This will come in time. I'm only I've been the NASA administrator for 4 years, and the President has given me a very challenging agenda of things to do. And I happen to love the president, the person for whom I work, and I am dedicated to make sure that NASA fulfills what the Congress and the president ask us to do. And for right now, that's trying, in human spaceflight, it's trying to develop a mission that will allow us to put humans with an asteroid by 2025 and get on to Mars in the 2030s. In the science arena, it is to continue to lead the world in science exploration and development. The Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Space Telescope, missions on the way to Jupiter, to Pluto. We have missions on the way to almost every planet in the solar system, or operating around almost every planet in the solar system, and planning for those that may not have been visited so far.
What is then the source of the fact that you differ with the Obama administration? There's been a lot, as you know, written about that. Where
I don't know. I read all the time, and I will tell you one thing I don't. I don't tweet, and so I don't pay any attention to whatever's out there about whatever these disagreements are. I read blogs every once in a while if somebody refers me to it. I have the best job in the world right now. I run the space agency. I run the world's greatest space agency with the world's greatest set of scientists, engineers, administrative support personnel, you name it. We're the best place to work in government. I don't have time to deal with things over which I have no control. I can't control critics. There are far too many people in this country who do not like the president and will never accept him. That's their problem, not mine. I like him. I work for him. His ideas are big ideas. He is looking to make this country, to continue to have this country sustain its position as the foremost, the dominant nation in the world in terms of technology and everything.
Should the shuttle have been shut down?
Oh, yes. Should have been. It should have been gone before we were able to do it. We just were not able to do it. And the reason had nothing to do with safety. A lot of people say, well, it was unsafe. Not true. Shuttle was, the last few flights we flew were flawless. And it's because, in fact, we spent as much time on development of things and looking at safety issues for the very last flight as we had done for the first flight, probably more. But we could not explore. The president knew that if we wanted to go beyond low Earth orbit, we could not continue to pour $2 billion a year into just maintaining the shuttle. So we had to phase shuttle out. It was really important for this nation to utilize the capabilities that we have in our industry and allow industry to do, it's not routine, but it's the best word I can use. Routine access to low Earth orbit is the business of industry, commercial enterprises, and entrepreneurship. We have equipped the nation's industry to do that. We work with them. They know how to do it very well, as demonstrated by SpaceX, soon to be demonstrated by Orbital. And we've got three incredible companies, Boeing, Sierra Nevada, SpaceX, that are vying to become the nation's first commercial provider for transportation for crew. So that's where we're replacing the shuttle. That's all shuttle could do, was access to low Earth orbit. We couldn't explore from it. We had to get into another vehicle once you got to low Earth orbit. And so now we're embarked on development of the heavy lift launch vehicle, multi-purpose crew vehicle Orion, to get crews to an asteroid, to Mars, to more distant places in our universe. And that's what we ought to be about.
How many astronauts are on the space station right now?
Right now there are 6. And as I mentioned before, 2 of the 6 are American. And that's a typical complement. Typically, there will be 2 to 3 Americans, 2 to 3 Russians, and then 1 or 2 at max of partner nation astronauts. It is a mini United Nations. There's an Italian right now.
We've got some video from NASA TV.
Yes.
And this gentleman's name is Babak Ferdowsi.
Ferdowsi. He's a Mohawk guy.
Yeah, and I'm going to combine that with another Mohawk story just for a moment. Let's watch this, though, for a second.
Hi, I'm Babak Ferdowsi, Flight Director on the Mars Science Lab Curiosity mission, and I'm back with another rover report. This past week on Mars, we did a SAM atmospheric sample, which is basically like taking a deep breath on Mars and smelling for chemicals. We also did a drive, the beginning of our road trip, basically. Along the drive, you'll see our tracks on Mars.
Hello, this is Charlie Bolden, NASA Administrator, speaking to you via the broadcast capabilities of the Curiosity rover, which is now...
We also had 2 firsts on Mars this week. First, we played back an audio file from Administrator Charlie Bolden, congratulating the team. That was the first time an audio file has been played back from Mars.
Roll the song. Here we go.
Mars might be far, but baby, it ain't really that far. Let's reach for the stars.
And second, on Tuesday, we played back the will.i.am song Reach for the Stars, meant to inspire kids, and that's the first time a song has been ever beamed back from Mars.
So,
We have fun.
how do you know, we've just recently watched, though, government having fun like the IRS.
Yeah.
How far can you go?
How far can you go and have fun?
Yeah,
And
in
stay
other
out
words,
of trouble?
and stay out of trouble, yeah.
You have to be very reasonable and measured in what you do. You have to make sure that the fun you're having is clearly related to the job you're trying to do. Our job is to inspire young people and to inspire today's generation. It is generally done through the arts, not through science. Science is incredibly exciting and important, but there are probably half the kids out there who will one day be rocket scientists who don't know that they like science today. They love music. And so will.i.am, who is a fanatic for robotics, will.i.am was present for the Mars rover, for the Curiosity Mars Science Laboratory launch at the Kennedy Space Center back in November, more than a year ago. And he was at JPL in Pasadena, California for the landing. And his dream was he said, you know, you guys aren't cool. And I want to help. And I said, okay, what do you want to do? He said, I want to write a song. And he wrote a song, composed a song, got, I think, 200 kids from all over the world to sing this song, and an orchestra. And he directed it. And we beamed it up to Curiosity, and the day after I think it was the day after I beamed the message down, thanking the team, we played Reach for the Stars from Mars. It went viral over YouTube. That's the way we communicate today. That's fun, and that's what I think anyone who wants to argue with me about whether or not that's wise expenditure of the taxpayers' money, I'll take that argument. You know, a lot of that comes for no cost. For us to put something on YouTube today, everybody uploads stuff to YouTube. NASA has been recognized through awards like the Sammys. We're recognized as one of the most innovative agencies of the government, and we're very proud of that. When you innovate, when you allow your workers to do things out of the ordinary. Mohawk guy, I mean, just think about it. How many, in the Apollo era, would you have seen a Mohawk guy, you think? Not like
you mentioned the Sammys. NASA has had a television network for years that the taxpayers have paid for. Yeah. Unlike every other agency of government, now Pentagon has one called the Pentagon Channel. Has NASA had an unfair advantage in selling what they do by having a television network?
Quite the contrary. If you look at NASA's communication, if you look at our budget, I defy anyone to find the line item for communications. David Weaver, who's my director of communications, one of the things I promised him when he agreed to come to work for us was he would not have to go around town with a tin cup. I haven't been able to do that yet. David goes from directorate to directorate begging for money to help tell their story. So our communications department put on the video that you just saw, but that was with funds that the directorates, the Science Mission Directorate, for example, had designated as an amount of money for education and public outreach. And so that is an example of what I call a very wise expenditure of the taxpayers' funds.
But you could also say, though, that that's a clever way of hiding the communications.
I mean, there are people who believe that. And if you wanted NASA not to communicate its story, if you wanted us not to talk about the great discoveries that we do, then theoretically, you know, somebody could take away all funds and prohibit us from ever broadcasting anything about what we do and say, you must rely on commercial television to do that.
You were involved in Kuwait?
I was. I lived in Kuwait for a year. Between wars.
Yeah, but what were you doing back then?
I had left the space program and come back to the operating forces of the Marine Corps, and at the time I was the commanding general of what was called the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force Forward. So we were about 200 of us, represented back then the warfighting MEF of the Marine Corps. Marine Expeditionary Force is the largest warfighting entity in the Marine Corps, and it has 3 components: a ground component, usually a division, an air wing component, usually a wing, and then a logistics component, which today is a logistics group, Marine Logistics Group. And so I had representatives from those 3 components with me living and working in Kuwait in case Saddam Hussein kind of went berserk or something. And we were the forward force that would prepare for everybody else to flow in.
When was your last day in the Marine Corps?
My last official day in the Marine Corps was the 1st of January 2003. That's the day of my retirement.
What did you do?
But I'm still a Marine.
And weren't you slated to go into the NASA as the number 2 guy back in the Bush administration?
I was nominated.
What happened to that?
I don't even talk about it. That's something that's water under the bridge. The president withdrew the nomination under pressure, I think. So I don't know.
What kind of pressure?
I have no idea, and I don't ask questions. I have heard so many stories that it came from Secretary Rumsfeld, who did not, because we were about to embark in, if you remember, this was post 9/11, and I was told that Secretary Rumsfeld felt that he couldn't justify sending an active duty general officer back to a civilian agency. And
does it work?
Does what work?
Putting a military man in a civilian agency. I mean, they clearly made NASA non-military.
Well, we've had 2 administrators, only 2, who have been. I'm not active duty, but Dick Truly was. I think he was active duty when he first came in as the NASA administrator.
And Sean O'Keefe was the Secretary of the Navy.
Sean O'Keefe had been the acting Secretary of the Navy. But I think if you have a person who is qualified, it makes no difference what their background is. I think I'm qualified for this job. Whether I am or not, historians will have to tell. I love my work. I think my people enjoy working for me. I try to make my job is to facilitate their success, to make them the #1 place to work in government. So one thing I've done is make them the best place to work, or I've allowed them to make us the best place to work in government.
You mentioned Chris Cassidy earlier, having been in Iraq and Afghanistan. How do you, and he's an astronaut now. Where is he now?
He is on the International Space Station. He's a SEAL. He's a Navy SEAL.
How does that happen?
Well, he wanted to be an astronaut. Probably, I haven't talked to Chris about whether this was a lifelong dream of his. We have at one time, about half of our astronauts were active duty military, and they come from all walks of life and from all over the military. I mean, I was a military test pilot when I applied for the space program, and I was picked up. And I went all the way through my 14-year career on loan to NASA from the Marine Corps. NASA reimbursed for my salary, but the Marine Corps, they let me go for 14 years, and then I went back.
So you say the International Space Station's been up there 13 years. What's it do?
Oh, we do lots of stuff. Most of it is scientific investigations in everything from life science, microbiological science, solar science. We now have a number of earth science experiments that are there looking at Earth, looking at the atmosphere. We now are doing technology development. There is something called the alpha magnetic spectrometer that is the product of many, many nations, more than 20 nations that have. It's a science experiment. It is a basic physics experiment looking at the beginning of time.
Who's in charge
of AMS or of the International Space Station?
International Space Station.
You could say I am, but I'm not really. The United States is the senior partner. There is a 5-organization partnership: the U.S. represented by NASA, Russia represented by Roscosmos, Japan represented by their space agency JAXA, Canada represented by Canadian Space Agency, and then 19 European nations represented by ESA, by the European Space Agency.
Okay, what is the obvious thing that you, from time to time, disagree about among those nations?
Flight opportunities. Who's gonna get their astronaut to fly in space? And the agreement, it's a treaty that brought us together as this entity. This is one reason I think on a side note, I think the International Space Station should be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, because it is. You asked this question earlier about the U.S. and Russia, our relationship. The International Space Station is a working relationship, a conglomeration of in excess of 20 nations around the world, everyone wanting to do what they want to do, everyone wanting an opportunity to fly their astronaut in space. But there are agreements in the treaty, and one of them is that flight opportunities come with donations to the station. So as nations, there is no exchange of funds except between us and Russia. Every other nation, it is in kind. So they either put a module up, they take components that go into the station, And the more they contribute, the more opportunities they have to fly an astronaut. So, because the U.S. is the dominant provider of supplies and funds and everything else, we pay for the transportation for all of our international partners.
So why are we paying Russia $450 million?
Because in the beginning, at the time, it was, when we started thinking about this, it was still the Soviet Union when we started thinking about things. We flew Apollo Soyuz when the original agreement was signed. Soyuz is the Russians' equivalent of shuttle. It carries 3 people at a time, and it is their human-rated spacecraft. And they don't change. They use the same thing over and over. So Soyuz has been around since the beginning of time.
Have you ever been in one?
I've never flown in one. No, I have not. But they're small. It's a 3-person capsule, smaller than an Apollo capsule, really. And that's the way we get our astronauts back and forth to space. What is going to be critically important about having American commercial capability is it takes us 2 Soyuz flights to get a complete crew to the International Space Station. All of our commercial partners are developing 7 crew capabilities. So it's their 2 pilots plus 7 passengers that they can carry up. So we can get a complete complement to the station plus 1 more science, investigator with the American capability that we'll have.
I want to show some more video because we're talking about Chris Cassidy.
Yeah.
This is not serious, as you've probably seen this. But you talked about the guy with the mohawk. Let's watch Chris Cassidy in space.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and give the full-on Luca Parmitano look for the hatch opening ceremony. So please join me to Chris's barbershop. Okay, so here's how we cut hair in space. We have the standard hair trimmer, but the hair would go all over the place. So we need to connect it to our vacuum cleaner, which is right here. And now we're ready to cut hair. What do you think so far? Should I stop here? Well, that's pretty close to what Luca has going on, but it's not quite the full Parmitano look. That's completely smooth on the top. So I still have one more step to do. I wonder if he does this every day. It kind of hurts.
Luca's the Italian
who
is on the space station right now.
Yes.
Does that kind of thing come from that? Is that his idea to do that?
That's totally Chris's idea. I am told that people have always accused Chris of he and Luca looking a little bit alike. And so it's sort of to make Luca feel at home. This is the story I was told. To make Luca feel at home, Chris decided, shucks, I look like you anyway. We may as well just become twins. And so he decided he would do that.
How long do they stay up there at a time?
They're there for 6 months at a time, but they'll overlap. So Luca coming up now is about halfway through Chris's tenure. Chris came up halfway through Chris Hadfield's tenure. Chris Hadfield was the Canadian who became an international sensation because of his guitar playing and his outreach to students through the downlinks into classrooms and everything else. So Chris will go home about halfway through Luca's tenure on the International Space Station.
Now, you said earlier you don't look back and you think that the job you have now is the best, but talk about the flying. We have some video of you over the 4 trips that you took on the space shuttle. Which shuttles were you on?
I was on 3 of the. I was on Columbia, my very first flight.
This is, you can comment on it.
That's probably on Columbia with now Senator Bill Nelson, as a matter of fact. That was my very first flight into space. It was the flight immediately prior to Challenger. We lost Challenger 10 days after this landing. My second and fourth flights were on Discovery, and the second one was when we deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. Discovery, the last time, was the first joint Russian-American mission. And then my third flight, which was the first time I was actually the commander on a mission, that's the Hubble crew right there with Dr. Kathy Sullivan, who's now the acting NOAA administrator and was America's first woman to walk in space. That's me on the treadmill. Everybody says, it is absurd that I am wearing a headband as if I'm keeping sweat from running down into my eyes. Gravity is overcome, so sweat just goes all over everywhere. But it looked good. This is me, I think, on my third flight, the first time I was actually a commander, and this was on Atlantis, on what we call America's first mission to planet Earth. This is Steve Hawley and me deploying the Hubble Space Telescope on the second flight. Absolutely incredible. You know, Hubble was huge, or is huge. 25,000 pounds, weighs nothing in space, filled up the payload bay. Very complicated the mission turned out to be, and that's pre-launch on Hubble. You'll notice that on this, you didn't see us pre-launch on my first flight, but back on my first flight, all we wore was a regular old flight suit and a helmet. And then post-Challenger, we went to wearing the launch and entry suit, feeling that it would, if we had another Challenger type accident, it would allow the crew at least some time, because that suit becomes a cocoon if you lose pressure in the cabin. It becomes like a small spacesuit. But that's what we did.
So after both the Challenger and Columbia, and we lost all the astronauts, what did that do?
For me, personally, or for the nation?
Just for you. I mean, what was your reaction?
I was, Columbia was devastating in and of itself, because I had been on the vehicle, but...
Was that 86?
That was, no, that was 2003. In fact, I had just...
Challenger was 86.
Challenger was 86. Yeah. That one was truly devastating, because I had actually trained with Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. We had made a switch in crews, I want to say about 6 months out. My first crew was the teacher in space flight. And then we switched to take a member of Congress. It turned out to be then Congressman Bill Nelson and Bob Sinker from RCA, because we flew a classified payload, a camera, an infrared imaging camera that Bob was the expert on. So, but to lose Challenger 10 days after we had come back, and the most spectacular time in my life at that time, to just go to the bottom. You couldn't go much farther. But I decided in a few nanoseconds that this was what I wanted to do, and I should be doing it, and dedicated myself to staying around.
Did you feel different the next time you went up?
By the time I flew on the Hubble mission, we had had a number of flights, and I had gotten myself back to the frame of mind where you don't worry about, you know, your own personal safety. You're really focused on the mission and what you're supposed to do. Hubble was the perfect second mission for me to follow on to Challenger, because we did not know, we had no clue how significant Hubble was going to be. We had no idea that it was going to change humanity's total understanding of our universe.
How did it do that?
It has revolutionized our understanding of the universe. It has rewritten textbooks, because a lot of things, even Einstein's, several of Einstein's theories, some it has substantiated, others it has said, oh, he wasn't exactly right. Just the issue of the universe expanding or contracting, Hubble has put definition on that. It allows us to see almost to the beginning of time, and so I'm not sure many people comprehended what Hubble was going to do in terms of opening up our horizons of understanding of our universe. We still don't know anything, by the way, but we know a heck of a lot more than we would have known had we not had Hubble.
How many astronauts are currently active?
In America, I want to say we have about 60 some odd. We're about to announce, probably early this coming week, next week, we'll announce the selection of 8 brand new astronauts who I am hoping that people will be very happy to see, because it's a new breed of cat. You know, I would never have made it with this group. Incredibly sharp individuals, every one of them, and I think people will be, anybody who knows anything about space and stuff will be really happy.
With only the space station having astronauts on it, what do those 60 do?
Oh, they are overworked. We have people in training for space station continually, and the difficult thing about training for station today is that going up on the Soyuz spacecraft, they have to be qualified to be crew members on Soyuz, because the American is almost always the flight engineer. So it means they have to, 3 things they have to do today that I didn't have to do. They have to be fluent in Russian, because they have to be able to read the instruments in Soyuz, and they have to be able to communicate with the Russian Mission Control in Moscow doing the launch up and coming back down. They have to be proficient in robotic operations, whether it's the International Space Station mechanical arm or the Japanese arm. And then everybody has to be able to do a spacewalk. When I was in the program, pilots were, not only did you not get an opportunity to do it, you were prohibited from doing a spacewalk because there were only 2 pilots on board, and we didn't want to run the risk of losing a pilot or having a pilot incapacitated because of the bends or some of the other risks that went along with spacewalk. Today, every astronaut has to be available to do a spacewalk on the International Space Station. So real different from when I was there.
So if you meet those little kids out there, which I'm sure you do from time to time, do you think there'll be more opportunities or less in the future?
Far more. And the reason there will be far more, shuttle was one giant leap because it went from the space program, at least the astronaut program, being all white males, 5'10" test pilots. I didn't look like any of them. Mae Jemison didn't look like any of them. Kathy Sullivan didn't look like any of them. Sally Ride didn't look like any of them. It went to allowing people like that to fly in space, and in groups of 7. One time we had an 8-person crew. So it increased the number of people flying per time. Now that we're about to usher in the era of commercial space, provided the companies can generate the interest that they think they can, normal, and normal is a bad word because astronauts are normal people, but more people outside of NASA will have an opportunity to go to space, whether it's what we call suborbital flight, like on Virgin Galactic, where you go like Alan Shepard, you go into space and come right back down. Those opportunities are now on the verge of taking place for normal human beings.
So where do you come down on this constant discussion about Neil Armstrong's first words on the moon?
I don't argue about it. I mean, Neil was a dear friend and a true American hero, and it doesn't matter to me what he said.
Well, I mean, it was like a small step for a man.
One small step for man and a giant leap for mankind, or one small step for a man and a giant leap for mankind. I'm not a purist, and I know what the message was.
Why do people fuss over it?
We fuss over everything. We fuss over whether it's cislunar space or translunar space that we're going to be operating in when we do our asteroid retrieval or our asteroid retrieval mission. It is important to some people, so don't get me wrong. We spend too much time over trivial things. The importance of the fact is the U.S. demonstrated that they could do something that no other nation in the world had ever done and has not done since. There have been 12 people to walk on the surface of the moon. Every single one of them was an American. That's important. That's what's important, not what Neil Armstrong said.
So the Chinese will be on the moon what year?
That's up to them to decide. They may never get there.
The Russians care?
Do the Russians care
about being on the moon?
I think every nation cares about. Every nation wants to be us. It is hard, sometimes I sound arrogant when I say every nation, every other space agency head wants to be in my place. They want to lead the most dominant space agency in the world. They want to be a part of the only government organization from the only country that has ever landed humans on another heavenly body, or the only country in the world that has ever successfully landed a vehicle on another planet, as we have done, I want to say 6, 7 times at least, putting things on Mars. No one else has ever. The Russians landed a vehicle on Mars and we never heard from it. We think it landed successfully, but I don't count it a success unless it talks to you and it's doing some stuff. So,
Charles Bolden, NASA Administrator, we are out of time, and we thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so very much. This was enjoyable. Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
Next, British Prime Minister David Cameron takes questions.